Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Russell Targ to the show today. He is the author of Limitless Mind, Do You See What I See, The End of Suffering, Miracles of Mind, and many, many more books. He is a pioneer of a protocol and a process that began in 1972 with Hal Puthoff, called remote viewing, which was the real X-Files espionage program. He also worked with Ingo Swann, a very famous psychic and artist who taught him how to do remote viewing. He is retired from Lockheed Martin as a senior staff scientist, where he not only developed laser technology for peaceful applications, but a way to detect wind shear, and offered this up to the FAA and to many airlines. It is a great honor to welcome Russell Targ to It's Rainmaking Time. Good morning.
Morning. I'm happy to be with you today.
I'm so delighted that you're here. I first want to talk about your work as a laser physicist and what it was like to come up with a discovery that would help the airlines and the FAA avoid crashes, and how you felt when they didn't use it.
Well, when I left my ESP work in 1983, the ESP work had become very classified, and I wanted to be able to write about that. So I quit the Stanford Research Institute program and went back to my roots, which was laser research. But my past decade had been in parapsychology, so I knew that I had to think of something more interesting, because Lockheed wouldn't let me start an ESP program. So I had been involved with laser research for my previous incarnation, previous 15 years. And I had always had the idea that you could measure wind velocity by shining a laser into the wind and then measuring the way the frequency of the light scattered back had changed. Like when you listen to a train whistle approaching you, the frequency goes up as the train approaches you and it goes down as it goes away. It's called the Doppler shift. And if the wind is blowing toward you, then the laser frequency is shifted up in frequency. If it's going away from you, shifted down. And I had the idea you could use that to measure wind velocity in front of an airplane. Because in the 1980s, there had been half a dozen passenger planes that had crashed in the United States due to wind shear. In the 80s, there were lots of big jets being put into service, and if they run into wind shear, which takes away their airspeed, we don't have to go into how that works, but they're landing or taking off, and suddenly they lose airspeed, and they crash because it takes a long time for an airplane to regain its momentum. That is what we say is that the engine takes many, many seconds to spool up. It's not like a car. You step on the gas and the car moves. Or with a propeller plane, you push the throttle to the wall and the plane speeds ahead. A jet takes quite a while before it notices that you're asking for more power. And when a plane runs into invisible wind shear, by the time it notices that, it's hit the ground. So I had a scheme. In the paper I published, we called it a premonitory wind sensor. It senses the wind many miles in front of the airplane so that the pilot can know in advance what he's going to encounter. I was doing remote sensing at Stanford, looking into the distance, looking into the future with ESP, and then I moved to Lockheed, looking into the future with lasers to save airplanes. And we did that mainly as a NASA program. So what I found is that looking into the future works actually more reliable with ESP than with lasers, because the lasers don't work worth a damn when it's raining, and the ESP is unaffected by the rain. So,
how did you feel, though, when the FAA and many airlines weren't interested in adapting your discovery when it could save so many lives?
Well, the idea was in the airline industry, safety doesn't sell. No airline is allowed or is interested in saying that my airline is safer than your airline, because they don't want the public to think that there's in fact any risk or any danger. So no one ever talks about safety. And what they say is that we're self-insured. So if my gadget costs $100,000 for an airplane, they say, well, that would be millions and millions of dollars. We will just buy insurance, and if an airplane crashes, we'll pay off the people from our insurance. So it's kind of self-insurance is what airlines do instead of upgrading their safety.
I'm surprised the FAA wouldn't make that mandatory.
It would have been a good idea, but by 1990, wind shear was getting to be better understood, and the airlines were training pilots better. Wind shear has a way of fooling pilots. It gives you increased wind speed, and then it takes it all away. It's a kind of sucker game. You're landing, and suddenly your airspeed increases, and you say, oh, good, I can throttle back, and then it's all gone. So pilots are learning about the nature of wind shear. Whenever you hear a plane that crashes during a rainstorm, it's wind shear. But in the past decade, pilots have become more skillful due to training. You probably don't need this expensive system anymore.
They probably learn it in simulations, right?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, great. I think it's still great that you discovered that and offered it up, because that could save a lot of lives. And we did hear about crashes for a long time.
I was grateful to Lockheed to give me an opportunity to return to laser work after this 15-year hiatus when I was doing psychic stuff. There was a big vote of confidence. What they knew is that in the 60s and 70s, I was well known for my laser work, and even though I'd been doing psychic stuff in the meantime, they did not hold it against me. But I came in with a good idea, and they said, that sounds pretty interesting. If you can sell ESP to the government, you can probably sell wind shear defense to NASA. We'll give you a chance to do that. And that was successful. I was at Lockheed for 12 years doing laser stuff.
Speaking of NASA, I read in Do You See What I See? You talked a little bit about Challenger. And that Challenger actually went down not only because of the O-rings, but also because of wind shear.
That's right. Richard Feynman demonstrated that a frozen O-ring won't function as a gasket, which many, many people knew at the time. But the O-ring had burned through on previous flights, so NASA was aware that the O-ring wasn't very good in low temperature, but it had managed to hold in previous flights, even though they knew that there was burning. What happened on this particular day is that they launched the Challenger, and then at 35,000 feet, there was a 100-mile-an-hour crosswind, which functioned as a wind shear for the spacecraft, and just ripped off the booster because the struts had been weakened from being burned through. See, by 35,000 feet, the spacecraft is almost ready to jettison the booster anyway. So the fact that it had been nibbled away at generally didn't matter if they were just going to get rid of it in moments. But what happened is the wind ripped it off in a violent way, and that's what caused the explosion. And that's in the President's report. NASA does not feature that. I mean, there's always secrecy in these things. NASA doesn't want to say that they were ignorant of this big crosswind at 35,000 feet, because that would show that their meteorological system doesn't work, which it doesn't. They would rather blame Thiokol, who made the O-rings, and say it's sort of an act of God. We didn't know that it was going to burn through, even though Thiokol knew it was going to burn through and would not give them a waiver. That whole thing is a top-down catastrophe. Lockheed, who was the ground crew at the shuttle at Cape Kennedy, didn't want to launch because it was way below temperature for launching. President Reagan insisted that they launch because he wanted to talk to Krista McCulley during the State of the Union message. So the big driver for launching in the sub-freezing temperature is the president's desire to have a teacher in space during the State of the Union message. So NASA insisted to Lockheed that they launch it. Thiokol, who made the spacecraft, said, no, we won't do it because it's way below our specifications. Lockheed told Thiokol, if you want any money from us, you have to give us a waiver. So the engineer who designed the O-ring said, fire me, it's not going to work, I won't approve it. And the president of Thiokol had to give him a waiver, all for the purpose of allowing Reagan to talk to the teacher. and then they launched it and it failed.